And we are proud to host Active 2025. We are proud to host Active 4. We are in the Caribbean, where the Atlantic meets the Caribbean Sea, where our people greet each other with warmth, with resilience. And so we open our hearts and our minds to all our guests who are with us today. We open our minds and our hearts to the partnership, to the dialogue, and to the conversation about economic prosperity, wealth creation, trade, development, and ultimately the dignity of African people everywhere. And so today we talk not just about Africa and the Caribbean, we speak of global Africa. And global Africa means Africa and its diaspora everywhere it is.
My people, you know there's a serious shift happening in the world when small Caribbean nations decide to say no to the United States and instead lean in toward Africa. That's not just diplomacy, no. That's defiance. That's not just trade. That's strategy. Because for decades, the relationship between the Caribbean and the West has followed a predictable script, right? Depend on U.S. trade. Depend on U.S. tourists. Depend on U.S. aid, rules, and approval. But now, the world is changing. Trump has introduced new tariffs, alliances are shifting, and the so-called backyards of empire are planting their own flags. At the AfroCaribbean Trade and Investment Forum, which took place in Grenada this week, something unprecedented happened. A Caribbean bloc, led by nations like Grenada, Barbados, and St. Vincent, pushed back on U.S. pressure, called out unequal trade relationships, and made it clear, we're done being stuck. We're ready to trade with Africa. Now, let me say that again. Caribbean nations just rejected America's plan and are choosing Africa instead. So today on The Breakdown, we're unpacking what exactly happened in Grenada, why Caribbean nations are pushing back on U.S. influence, and how this new Afro-Caribbean alliance could reshape global power. Because this isn't just a political pivot, it's a signal that the Caribbean and Africa are finally rediscovering each other, not through slavery and exploitation, but through trade, partnership, and shared destiny. This moment might feel small, maybe, but history tells us it's the small, defiant acts that spark the biggest changes. We're going to break it down, but first, thank you to all of our new subscribers and members. And if you're watching and haven't joined us yet, I invite you to join our growing family here at PanaGenius TV. Hit subscribe and tap the alert so you never miss a new release from us. All right, now let's get into it. So let's give this the full context that it deserves, right? The AfroCaribbean Trade and Investment Forum is taking place in Grenada this week, July 28th and 29th. It's being hosted by the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, in partnership with the government of Grenada and CARICOM. Now, on the surface, it looks like a typical summit. Flags, panels, speeches. But beneath it all, something deeper is unfolding. This year's event wasn't just another feel-good conference, no. It was a clear declaration that the Caribbean is no longer content to be entrapped in the old colonial trade routes, that it's time to look east, across the Atlantic, to Africa. Now, CARICOM Secretary General Carla Barnett put it plainly.
We must also decisively open the door to greater trade between our regions. CARICOM trade with the continent must grow beyond the current levels of less than 3%, let me repeat that number, 3% of our overall trade.
Yes, 3% of trade. That's how little the Caribbean trades with Africa today. Despite centuries of shared struggle, migration, and culture. Despite the fact that both regions face the same challenges, climate vulnerability, debt traps, supply chain fragility, and economic dependence. So what exactly is the holdup? Well, in part, it's because the West designed it that way. The Caribbean was engineered to depend on U.S. tourists, on U.S. markets, on former European colonial powers. But now, those relationships are fraying. Trump has imposed tariffs on Caribbean goods. He has intensified pressure to roll back investment migration programs, and his growing security demands, particularly around deportation agreements and regional policing, are raising alarms. At this very forum, Caribbean leaders are pushing back. Quietly, but unmistakably, they are rejecting Washington's tone, refusing to become pawns in someone else's geopolitical game, and instead are reaching across the ocean toward Africa. Not just for trade, but for dignity, for strategy, for self-definition. And for the Caribbean nation hosting it all, Grenada, it isn't just policy, it is personal. A continuation of a legacy that dates back to revolution, resistance, and one leader who tried to do this decades ago. Grenada didn't just host this forum because it had extra ballroom space, right? There's a deeper reason. This tiny island nation, just over 100,000 people, has a long and radical history of standing up to global power. And that history begins with a name you may not hear often in school textbooks, but you should. Maurice Bishop. In 1979, Bishop led the Grenadian Revolution. He overthrew a corrupt regime backed by the West and launched a bold socialist experiment rooted in self-reliance, people, power, and solidarity with Africa and the global South. His government aligned with Cuba. He welcomed doctors and engineers from Ghana and Tanzania, and he famously said, "Our foreign policy is not based on whether you're a capitalist or a socialist, but whether you respect the right of people to determine their own future." Bishop saw Grenada not as a forgotten outpost of empire, but as a bridge between the Caribbean, Africa, and the broader anti-imperialist world. He was young, he was charismatic, just brilliant, and he terrified the West. Because Grenada under Bishop wasn't playing the game. It wasn't asking for permission. It was building a different world. And so in 1983, with Cold War tensions at a boil and internal divisions in his party, Bishop was assassinated. Days later, the U.S. invaded Grenada, Operation Urgent Fury, under the pretext of restoring democracy. But let's be clear, it wasn't democracy they feared. It was independence. It was vision. It was the audacity of a small Black nation choosing its own path. And now, over 40 years later, Grenada is once again stepping into that legacy by hosting the AfroCaribbean Forum, by pushing back against Western pressure, and by aligning not with Washington, but with Africa. This is more than economics. This is unfinished business. A quiet revolution that's been waiting decades to be resumed. And it's not just Grenada. There's a broader pattern unfolding across the region: Barbados, St. Vincent, Suriname, Guyana, all looking across the ocean with fresh eyes. So what's driving this shift? Well, let's unpack the pressure and the opportunity.
This bridge building is not a one-man show. The onus must be on all of us, whether we are large or small, whether we are humongous or tiny, whether we lead nations or we lead startup companies, to carry the bridge building forward. We must commit collectively and individually to continuously closing the gap between our two regions. Not just geographically, not just diplomatically, not just in spirit. We must do so commercially, practically, with systems and with institutions.
Now, let's be real. The Caribbean has never had the luxury of economic independence. For centuries, these nations were designed to serve empire. First, it was Britain and France, and now, in many ways, the United States. And while independence gave them flags and anthems, the money, the markets, and the muscle, well, they still flowed through Washington. But that grip is loosening. Here's why. Number one, U.S. economic pressure is increasing. Earlier this year, the U.S. rolled out a sweeping 10% blanket import tariff, impacting hundreds of Caribbean exports, from sugar to rum to manufactured goods. Now, the message was clear. America will protect its own interests, even if it hurts its neighbors. And to that, you add visa restrictions on Caribbean nationals, delays in hurricane recovery aid, pushback on the region's citizenship by investment programs, which the U.S. claims are a security threat. And suddenly, what once felt like partnership now feels like pressure. And secondly, deportation demands. Washington is ramping up deportation flights, pressuring Caribbean countries to accept deportees, including individuals who haven't lived in the region for decades. It's a recurring theme. The U.S. makes the rules, Caribbean nations just clean up the mess. Leaders across CARICOM are growing tired of it. And at the AfroCaribbean Forum in Grenada, they're making that frustration known, not with fire and fury, but with action. They didn't stage a walkout. They didn't deliver anti-American speeches. They simply built new relationships without asking for permission. Strategic realignment. That's the third one. African nations, by contrast, are showing up differently. They're offering preferential trade agreements through the African Continental Free Trade Area, yes, joint tourism and aviation deals, shared climate resilience strategies, and perhaps most importantly, mutual respect. There is no history of colonial domination between Africa and the Caribbean. There is history of pain, yes, but also shared struggle, shared culture, shared bloodlines. So when Africa comes to the table, it's not with conditions, it's with curiosity and collaboration. And for African leaders, that's refreshing. Because when you've spent decades being dictated to, the opportunity to build horizontally with equals, not superiors, is a game changer. And that shift in tone, in partnership, in posture, is why so many Caribbean nations are finally saying, enough. It's time to choose our own terms. And maybe, just maybe, Africa is the partner we've been waiting for. Now let's look at how that vision is beginning to take shape in trade, diplomacy, and identity. Let's talk about what this new alignment actually looks like. Because this isn't just some feel-good Pan-African fantasy, right? This is about strategy. It's about survival, really. Infrastructure, commerce, and the quiet building of something bigger than what colonial borders ever allowed. Let's break that down. 1, trade and investment. At the forum, African and Caribbean leaders are signing new memorandum of understanding focused on maritime shipping routes between West Africa and the Caribbean, joint investments in renewable energy, infrastructure, and agribusiness, expanding interregional banking and digital payment systems via Afreximbank and Caribbean financial institutions. That's not theoretical. That's a pathway to reducing dependence on US and European trade networks by simply creating new ones across the Atlantic. Number 2, tourism and cultural exchange. Barbados, St. Lucia, and Ghana have all expressed interest in launching direct flights between the Caribbean and African nations. Imagine this, Afro descendants tracing their ancestry not through a 2-week trip to London, but through a direct cultural bridge. Bridgetown to Accra, Port of Spain, to Dakar. This is in tourism. This is healing. It's roots. It's economic diplomacy through cultural reconnection. And number 3, education and talent pipelines. And this is critical. Grenada's Prime Minister has floated a proposal. African universities should open campuses in the Caribbean. Likewise, Caribbean medical and law schools, many of which already attract international students, are now being positioned to welcome more African students. This could be the beginning of a brain circulation system, my people, not just from south to north, but south to south. And number 4, political voice. CARICOM and the African Union are in early talks to coordinate more closely at global forums like the UN, WTO, and climate summits. Because when these two blocs speak as one, they represent over 1.5 billion people. That's not a margin. That's a majority. That's power, if we choose to wield it. And make no mistake, this isn't just a rejection of the US. No, it's a reclamation of each other. Africa and the Caribbean were never supposed to unite. You see, they were strategically divided by geography, by empire, by stolen memory. But this week, in Grenada, in Accra, in Bridgetown, in Nairobi, those walls are starting to crack. And what's emerging isn't just nostalgia for what was lost. It's a vision of what could finally be built. So now we ask the question that always follows moments like this, right? Is this real? Is this just another summit, another speech, another handshake for the cameras before everyone goes back to, business as usual? Because let's be honest, we've seen this before. We've been here so many times. Declarations of solidarity, flags waved, photo ops shared, and then silence, nothing. So what's different this time? Here's what gives me hope and also what makes me cautious. What's different is that this isn't just coming from politicians. It's being backed by institutions like Afreximbank, which is putting real money, hundreds of millions, behind interregional trade. Policy shifts like direct trade routes, negotiations, and shared climate agendas. Grassroots energy, as more African-descended people in the Caribbean and the diaspora demand deeper reconnection, not just cultural, but economic. And let's not forget the contest. The global south is rising. BRICS is expanding. The West's grip is weakening. And regions that were once pawns in someone else's game are realizing that, hey, they have enough pieces to flip the board. Again, it's necessity. It's survival. But let's be clear about what we're up against here, right? Colonial economic structures are still deeply embedded. Shipping, finance, legal systems all still favor Western routes. Foreign debt still chokes the ability to invest in new ventures. Internal fragmentation, both within Africa and the Caribbean, means that it's easy to talk about unity and very hard to act on it. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: symbolism without systems leads to stagnation. So what's the takeaway? This isn't a magic moment. It's an opening. And openings are only as powerful as what we do with them. The question isn't about the forum. It's whether Grenada and the rest of us are ready to build a new Atlantic future. One that doesn't run through London or Washington or Paris, but through Accra, through Port of Spain, through Lagos, through Bridgetown. That's the real test. So where do we go from here, my people? Caribbean nations are saying no to the world's most powerful country. And yes, to something deeper. something bolder, something rooted not in nostalgia, but in strategy. For the first time in decades, we saw a real shift, a shift away from dependency and toward continental kinship with Africa. And let me just say this, it's not perfect, right? It's not polished, but it's happening. And let's be clear, this moment didn't come out of nowhere. It's the result of decades of tension between what the Caribbean was designed to be and what it's now daring to become. For too long, our people on both sides of the Atlantic have been separated by ocean, by empire, by economic control. But what if that's changing? What if the Caribbean and Africa could become partners, not in pain, but in possibility? Trade routes, shared development banks, educational exchange, cultural reconnection, coordinated climate action. That's not just some fantasy, right? It's possible with strategy. And it's what the global South has been missing, horizontal power. So here's my question for you. Will this be a headline we forget next week, or the start of something we choose to build? Because unity isn't just about one event or one summit, right? It's a decision, one that we have to keep making over and over and over again until it becomes our new reality. My people, the old Atlantic world was built on chains, but the new one, we have a chance to build it on choice. So now I turn it over to you. What kind of Atlantic future do you want to see? Is this Caribbean-Africa alignment long overdue? What would you like to see from this partnership? Trade, tech, tourism, all of the above? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know. Let's talk about it. That's it for today's show. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng, and until next time, take care. Hey you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.